Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And it's best to be last. I think with the last name Zemlin, I'm used to it. How many people here have heard of the Linux Foundation? Just a quick show of hands. All right, sounds like most of you. So we're home to Linux, Kubernetes, PyTorch, RISC-V, fundamental building blocks of all modern technology, and fundamental building blocks of artificial intelligence. In fact, the creator of Linux, probably one of the greatest software developers in the world, works at the Linux Foundation, maintaining the Linux kernel to this day. And as the head of the foundation, technically, I'm Linus Torvalds' boss, but he does not listen to anything that I say. Today, I want to talk to you about something important, about how open source is impacting the world of artificial intelligence and about the opportunities and challenges that presents. Let's start by looking at something that everybody's been talking about for the last few weeks. On January 27th this year, NVIDIA stock took a nosedive after Chinese AI model DeepSeek launched to incredible fanfare. Here was this fully open source model trained at a fraction of the cost, freely available for anyone to use. Investors panicked and had a huge sell-off. In reality, though, NVIDIA soon bounced back. Why? Because the market quickly realized that open source, like DeepSeek, expands the overall market for AI hardware. More models in more hands means that the market will shift to inference workloads as opposed to just training demand, and more specialized GPUs will be needed, which means more business for NVIDIA, but also more business for everybody else that can provide better and cheaper tools. This is how tech markets grow. And if we assume the demand for intelligence is almost limitless, we should all be very, very bullish. But don't take my word for it. Take Sam Altman's word. He reacted by saying, hey, maybe open source, we're on the wrong side of history when it comes to open source. And as I was writing this talk yesterday, Sam actually announced that they are open sourcing a new model later this year. That's how fast the AI world is moving, and that's how important open source is. Even OpenAI is now talking about open sourcing large language models. However, this isn't new. Since Facebook's founding, Mark Zuckerberg has been a huge proponent of open source. Last year, he was very, very clear on their earnings call. Open source AI is the path forward, reflecting a philosophy he's championed for decades. He believes that open code fosters industry-wide trust, better innovation, but most importantly, at the end of the day, delivers better products for billions of users. Kai-Fu Lee, AI pioneer at both Microsoft and Google, also sees the future as open source, last week declaring that open source AI is the winner. He talks over and over about how open innovation help industries leapfrog quickly because solutions built on public code can be customized for specific needs. So what exactly is going on here? What DeepSeek has proven out and expanded with their latest release is that you can, one, deliver cost-effective training. DeepSeek's R1 model was trained on a massive reduction in cost, some say up to 10 times as a comparable LLM. They also delivered near equal performance. In benchmark, DeepSeek trails the proprietary models by only a couple percentage points, and in their latest release, some say outperforms them. The economics here should be disturbing to closed-source model investors pouring billions into something that is now freely available for all, and for all practical purposes, free of charge. Here is the important thing to understand. DeepSeek's not going to be the only one here. The next version of Llama, the new model that Sam Altman just announced that we'll see later this year, are coming. It is now clear that investments will have to shift. Because if you thought your model was untouchable, think again. An open source community can come out of nowhere and innovate as fast as established players in astonishingly little time. So how did this happen? This is the big question. DeepSeek seemed to come out of nowhere. Now, some people thought this was a backfire in trade policy, that limited access to semiconductor technology forced DeepSeek to think more creatively, more sort of this necessity is the motherhood of invention. And that's probably true. But for anybody who's been watching China for the last 20 years, you know that this did not come out of nowhere. In the 90s, Chinese firms began promoting open source as alternatives to proprietary software and to comply with IP rules globally. I used to go there and people would ask me, hey, Jim, how can we get more Linux usage in China? And back then, my response was always the same. You have to stop making all software free through piracy. And to their credit, China did it, eventually adopting open source software in AI, cloud computing, and much, much more. They also started contributing back. Chinese developers now rank among the top contributors to Linux, Kubernetes, and many other definitional open source projects. By 2020, open source was specifically mentioned at the highest levels of policy in Chinese 5-year plan. And by 2025, the ecosystem had been laid for the groundwork that gave us DeepSeek. But here is the important punchline. Many people think this is some plot to outdo foreign competitors. But the reality is, this is how Chinese organizations and industry are competing with each other. The honest answer, when I talk to folks over there, is they're not thinking about us all that much. It's kind of like assuring a friend who just got a new haircut, relax. Nobody's checking you out. They're busy buying their own groceries. You know, competition within China is fierce. They are vying for market success day in and day out, creating an intensely innovative environment using open source. So where did they learn this? They learned it from us here in the United States. Over the past 30 years, the US tech landscape has embraced open source that have fundamentally changed and reshaped industry and made a lot of folks a lot of money on the way. In the late 90s, Red Hat proved that open source is a viable business model with their IPO in 1999. That momentum carried through into the 2000s and 2010s, where venture capitalists invested billions in open source startups like GitHub, Databricks, MongoDB, and many, many more. Meanwhile, hyperscalers doubled down on open source. Google open-sourced Kubernetes in order to change cloud technology from virtual machines to containers, something they knew better than Amazon, in order to level the competitive landscape. In the last few years, open source AI innovation in the United States has exploded. Hugging Face notched a valuation of $4.5 billion. Big names like Meta and IBM embraced open source AI models to drive cost-effective, cutting-edge performance at scale. Let me be super clear on this. None of it was done to give up competitive advantage. Quite the opposite. Open source has shown time and time again it is a tool to gain competitive advantage. And Intel knows this game very, very well. After all, Linux was created on x86. Open source wasn't just built on Intel architecture. Open source was used to open new markets for Intel. Early on, the company identified Linux and other open frameworks as tools to undercut rival Unix processors from vendors like Sun. By ensuring Linux ran optimally on x86 hardware, Intel opened up doors to telecommunications providers, enterprise IT, cloud operators, eager to shift away from costly proprietary software coupled with proprietary architectures. Today, Intel is smartly doubling down again on open source with projects that enable AI workloads, projects like the Open Platform for Enterprise AI, the Unified Acceleration Foundation, which I'll talk about later. So what happens if you go against open source? This is a cautionary tale of companies that try to restrict access to open source, fight against an open source community. They end up either bankrupt or irrelevant because they failed to adapt. And there's another set of organizations that have adapted and completely turned around their businesses. The best example, surely, is Microsoft, that went from calling Linux a cancer to acquiring GitHub and becoming one of the top open source leaders in the world. But what about two of the most valuable companies on earth, NVIDIA and Apple? Are they big open source advocates? 100%. NVIDIA participates in a huge myriad of open source projects and is continuing to increase its investment every day. But what about Apple? All right, so some people will tell me, like, surely, Jim, Apple has got to be an exception to the rule, right? If there's any closed source company out there, it's got to be them. Well, I'm not so sure, and I would like you all to do an experiment with me. How many people here have an iPhone? Pull out your iPhone. You can take it out. I want you to go into Settings, General, Legal and Regulatory, then go into Legal Notices. And just start scrolling. Tell me what you see. You will see licenses from HandyJSON from Alibaba under an open source license. You'll see OpenSSH, the BSD kernel. The Free Software Foundation is in there. Keep scrolling. It takes a while, because there are hundreds and hundreds of open source components in any modern system. Why? Why does Apple use open source? Because there's trillions of dollars worth of high-quality software building blocks out there to build an iPhone or any technology product. You read that right, $9 trillion, according to a recent research study by Harvard Business School. That is why today, the vast majority of code in any modern technology product or service is open source. It's kind of like this open source hamburger. You take an open source framework, you take a bunch of different open source reusable building blocks, they're all freely available, and the only code you write yourself is that 10, 15% of code that matters to your customers. This is why open source is so unstoppable. So let's dive a little bit into open source in AI. I think I've painted a good picture about how important open source is, but let's see how it impacts the AI industry. First, we want to get our definition straight. When people say open source AI, I'm talking about a publicly released model that anyone can freely use, customize, and improve. The Linux Foundation actually has a model openness framework that has a progression of openness from models that allow for free usage and provide access to the weights, but keep the data private, all the way up to fully transparent code, weights, data pipelines. Everything is public, everything's under a neutral governance to ensure fair collaboration. What's important is for folks to understand what level of openness you're getting, and that framework helps clarify that. So now that we know what open is, let's take a look at a typical AI stack. Now, I don't really need to explain this diagram to all of you. Sort of AI starts at the hardware and cloud software layer. That data is taken and gets stored and prepared. Above that is tooling and LLM ops to handle tasks like pipeline orchestration, training oversight, security. And then next comes foundation models. Often open models, like the Llama models are found on Hugging Face. Those get fine-tuned for even more specialized tasks. And then finally, at the top are applications. And this is the important thing for you to remember when it comes to open source impact on AI. What open source does at every layer of the stack is it reduces cost. It creates more competition. And it allows you to focus only on the highest order value when you're building your AI solutions, the actual application itself. Lip-Bu yesterday said, Intel's dedicated to your dream, your application. So is open source, by making it cheap and easy for you to build these applications, and by providing choice and competition at every level of the AI stack. Open source is all about providing these building blocks. Just like Node.js or React are used as web frameworks to create modern applications, there are now similar open source projects in AI frameworks emerging. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. I encourage all of you to check out the Open Platform for Enterprise AI, OPEA. This is a project that came out of Intel, is now housed at the Linux Foundation, and is one of our fastest growing open source projects. This project can help you deploy AI costs, slash the amount of time it takes to set it up by 40%, thanks to ready-made open source solutions for data ingestion, model serving, and more. With Kubernetes and Helm, open source software under the hood, you save another 50% on deployment. No reinventing workflows or vendor-specific tools. OPEA is also hardware agnostic. It's supported by Intel, AMD, ARM, and supports all the major hyperscalers. It also has predefined blueprints, an end-to-end chatbot stack with specific instructions to integrate vector database, conversational AI frameworks, and more, getting you live faster. All of this is freely available for all of you to use and to participate in the actual co-development of the framework itself. And if you need help, there's a huge partner ecosystem that's participating in this project. Big names like Dell, H3C, and NetApp have all contributed storage and hardware expertise. Intel and AMD have done CPU, GPU validation and performance optimizations. Infosys and Red Hat can provide consulting and integration. This is an amazing example of a next-generation open source project that you should check out as you're building your enterprise AI solutions. So I think I've convinced you all that open source is important in general, important in AI, and can help you focus on that highest order value, the applications that you're building. So where do we go from here? How do we make sure that open source continues to thrive and continues to allow you to focus on what's most important to you and your customers? We need to remember that open source doesn't just happen. And now that open source is a fundamental building block of technology, it's caught the eyes of regulators, cyber criminals, patent trolls, and others in the world that I'm broadly characterizing as the regulated era of open source. Over the past 3 decades, open source has evolved from sort of a niche experiment, copying proprietary technology, to, by 2010s, becoming the source of innovation, with breakthroughs such as OpenFlow, Docker, Kubernetes, and PyTorch, not emulating closed solutions, but being the source of AI innovation. It was no longer copying, it was where things started. Now, in 2025, we're entering an important new era of open source that invites new scrutiny and challenges. And while open source remains the engine of innovation today, today's questions center on how to maintain security, governance, and neutrality so that anyone can continue to participate and take advantage of this fundamental building block. I think what it means to all of us is that open source, is no longer a nice to have, and that the days of minimal scrutiny are over, and that we're all going to have to work together to solve new problems. Regulators are creating new rules that impact open source communities, like the EU's Cyber Resiliency Act, privacy laws like GDPR. Meanwhile, supply chain hacks and zero-day exploits can hit everything from startups to government agencies. So regulators and enterprises are demanding better processes and better security. Add into that sort of geopolitical tensions and techno-nationalism, and open source communities are now being required to navigate an ever-shifting, more complex world. And so the question I want to ask all of you is, how can we all work together so that we can continue to trust open source and open source AI tooling? And let me give you a way to think about this. In order to make sure that we preserve this incredible $9 trillion asset, we should be asking ourselves 3 questions. What is the world's most critical software? Not all projects are equal. There are millions of open source projects on GitHub, and we just can't scrutinize all of them. The second question is, who writes this code? If a flaw appears in an open source project, if there's a zero-day vulnerability, the people who need to fix that are the actual developers who wrote that code. But often, the only thing we know about them is their GitHub handle. It's kind of like the internet meme. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. We need better ways to know who's working on this software and how we can trust them. And finally, we need to know whether these open source projects are secure and healthy. We need to find vulnerabilities earlier. We need to help critical projects navigate complex regulatory and geopolitical obstacles. Now, this applies to all software, open or closed. But in open source, we have some unique opportunities to respond to these challenges. On the first question, the Linux Foundation is partnering with Harvard University to produce a census of actual open source usage. We went out and talked to enterprises who provided an anonymous software bill of materials stack for all their open source code. We aggregated that across the entire industry and found that there really are only thousands of open source projects that matter as opposed to millions. And then we ranked these based on security criticality in order to be able to focus on the most important open source first. Now, it turns out that this second question, who writes it, is a lot more difficult to understand. And this is where we need to create new tools. You know, it's sort of ironic that sometimes the answer to problems in tech is more tech, but in this case, I think that's true. And at the Linux Foundation, we created something called the First Person Project. This is a decentralized trust network using blockchain technology and privacy-respecting digital wallets. This issues cryptographically verified credentials. Have you had a validated identity? Have you shown up at an event like this? Do you have a known employer? And developers can share those credentials based on the policy of whatever open source project they want to participate in. And with that, we get trust scores for open source projects. This project has people who have known identities, they have known employers, they're people who we've physically met, and we know that we can trust the code that comes from them. We think this is an important way to scale trust across the internet. And by the way, this happens today in the Linux kernel. The kernel developers, however, just do this face-to-face using key signing parties where they look at each other's identity and exchange cryptography keys. The first-person project will allow that to scale. Finally, and most importantly, we need open governance. This is a lot more than an open source license. In order to handle trade disputes, export controls, geopolitical shifts, in order to underwrite security work, to catch vulnerabilities earlier, to secure our collective supply chain, we need governance. And at the Linux Foundation, we're building compliance tools, policy guidance, security initiatives. A few years ago, we launched something called the Open Source Security Foundation, that helps projects improve their security and improves the entire security of the open source supply chain. These are things that we need to all work on together to meet this new challenge in a regulated era of open source. So my plea to all of you today is to keep the world open. And so the question is, what can all of you do to support that software that you all depend on, that helps you focus on the applications you're building? And here's my advice and call to action. First, use open source to get business value. Most of you are already obviously doing this. Continue to do it. You can trust this software. Second, engage meaningfully in open source communities. Intel does it, but we'd like to see a lot more of you in our projects, either supporting the developers through participating in organizations like mine, or directly having your engineers contribute code to improve this open source software. Finally, and in closing, get out the word. It is important that you make sure that your management, your policy people, promote the concept that open source is a fundamental building block, that it's something that fosters innovation and better competition, and it's good for all of us. So thank you very much, and the Linux Foundation will continue to be here to support Intel and all of you. Appreciate it.